Schönen guten Tag, liebe Seherinnen und Hörer des YouTube-Kanals der Zeitschrift International. Hier spricht wieder Fritz Edlinger. Nach einer etwas längeren Pause, die wir dazu benutzt haben, unser nächstes Heft, gedrucktes Heft, zu produzieren. Es kommt also in etwa einer Woche zu jenen, die unsere Abonnenten der Zeitschrift sind, genutzt haben. Wiederum ein kurzes Video, etwas längere und noch längere werden in den nächsten Tagen folgen. Dieses kurze Video soll nur darauf hinweisen, was zum Teil Redaktionsmitglieder von international, neben international, darüber hinausgehend auch medial, wissenschaftlich, publizistisch tun. Und zweitens, und damit beginne ich gleich zunächst, als erstes möchte ich hinweisen auf eine Kooperation, die wir schon seit einigen Jahren haben mit einem jungen Schweizer Politikwissenschaftler und Neutralitätsexperten, Dr. Pascal Lottaz. Er ist sicher den regelmäßigen Leser und Leserinnen unserer Zeitschrift ein Begriff. Er publiziert regelmäßig vor allem über Fragen der internationalen Beziehungen und vor allem natürlich als Schweizer ist es klar über Neutralität. Pascal Lottaz arbeitet an einer Universität in Japan. Er unterrichtet dort über Neutralitätspolitik und er hat einen eigenen Blog eingerichtet vor einiger Zeit, der Neutrality Studies heißt. Wir haben darüber ohnehin schon mehrfach berichtet und ich möchte diesen Blog auf jeden Fall noch einmal nachdrücklich empfehlen. Er ist großteils in englischer Sprache, daher ist er natürlich auch erfolgreicher als unserer in deutscher Sprache, aber Pascal bringt sehr, sehr wichtige und interessante News zu allen möglichen Themen und er ist natürlich um ein Eckhaus, wenn man so sagen darf, erfolgreicher, weil er halt im gesamten englischsprachigen Raum verbreitet ist als wir. In Folge dieses kurzen Vorspannes werden wir ein Video von Pascal veröffentlichen, wo er über seine Arbeit, über seine wesentlichen Kriterien seiner Arbeit und seines öffentlichen Agierens berichtet. Sinnigerweise in englischer Sprache, allerdings live aufgenommen in der freien Natur in Vorarlberg, weil Pascal gerade bei einem Heimaturlaub in der Schweiz war und bei diesem Heimaturlaub hat er auch die Grenzüberschreitung nach Österreich durchgeführt und wendet sich in dem folgenden Video an die Leserinnen und Hörerinnen seines Kanals und über uns auch unseres Kanals. Bitte hört euch das an. Verlinkt euch auch zu seinem Kanal Neutrality Studies. Und in weiterer Folge, hier wird es dann kein eigenes Vorwort mehr geben, werden wir auch ein oder zwei Videos veröffentlichen von Interviews, die eines unserer langjährigsten und aktivsten Redaktionsmitglieder, Heinz Gärtner, Professor Heinz Gärtner, emeritierter Professor für Politikwissenschaft der Wiener Universität, publiziert hat. Nur als Hinweis, als ein Beispiel, wie inzwischen, wir sind sehr dankbar dafür, Redaktionsmitglieder, regelmäßige Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeiter, Autorinnen und Autoren von international, eben auch international agieren und auch von ausländischen Nachrichten, Sendungen, Sendern gefragt werden nach ihrer Meinung. Bitte schaut und seht euch diese Videos an, um zu sehen, dass international nicht nur ein enges provinzielles Produkt aus Österreich ist. In diesem Sinn herzlichen Dank für die Aufmerksamkeit und wie gesagt bereits vorweg angekündigt, in Kürze kommen wiederum ausführlichere Informationen über unser neues Heft und über einige darin behandelte Themen. Es gibt eine Menge Aktuelles, das ausführlich zu berichten und zu diskutieren ist. Aber bis dahin wenige Tage Pause mit der Bitte, diese beiden oder diese 3 Videos sich anzusehen. In diesem Sinn, alles Gute und bis zum nächsten Mal.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm spending this weekend in the Austrian Alps at my friend's place, and I thought I'm going to use this opportunity to talk to you about the last 1.5 years of this channel, some of the talks we heard and what we have learned, and especially this question of why is it that Europe seems to be at war, at least mentally. It's something that I call the logic of war and war mentality. It's articles like these that just keep making me want to throw up day and every day again. From the New York Times from today, September 2nd, a brutal path forward for Ukraine, village by village. Well, there's another path forward, and that's through negotiations. But why is it that neither the North Americans nor the Europeans seem to be willing to contemplate this? The Kremlin has said time and again that they are open for negotiations, as long as they're realistic. And the Europeans are saying like, no. And the Ukrainians are saying like, we won't have any of that. It's going to be all or nothing. Get back the Donbass, get back Crimea, to which they are entitled to. Don't get me wrong. They are entitled to that. But it's not realistic to stop the dying and stop the killing. So we've got other articles like Ukraine's offensive has made notable progress, White House says, and we have read this over and over again. It's these articles that make us think that victory is around the corner and Ukraine, the underdog, will beat the evil overlords. But we've also learned and seen over the last 1.5 years that's just not what's happening. And yes, Western propaganda tries to actually sell us the idea that the Russians are about to lose this war and that this large army has made only incremental gains. But the sheer fact is that Russia is not willing to lay waste to Kiev and Lviv and use all its potential that it has in order to wage an actual war. So the question is, why can we not get back to peace negotiations, and why can we not end this war the way that almost every single European war ends, which is in a conference? 1815, the Congress of Vienna, is what ended the Napoleonic Wars. The Crimean War was ended in negotiations. You've had 1918 Versailles, you had 45 San Francisco, you had the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe during the Cold War, which was the beginning of the end of the Cold War back in 1975. So the question is, when do we sit down and hammer out a peace agreement for a new European security architecture and structure, and why is it that we can't get there? And one of the sad issues here is that the way that this war has galvanized public opinion in Europe has made it almost impossible to get to a moment when Europeans are willing again to talk to the Russians. RT is banned, Sputnik is banned, all of these cultural events all around Russia and so on were banned, and that is part of the logic of war. If you want a real enemy, you need to demonize that enemy, and that demonization has taken place partially because of the goals of the neocons, as we have heard in some of the talks that I had on this channel, and partially because you have this willing journalistic propaganda machine that lends itself to just fostering such an environment. And that has to do with the idea that these journalists have of doing good, doing the right thing, right? Just as one of the speakers on this channel said, it would be wrong to not support Ukraine, and Ukraine is the new good thing to do. And the amazing thing, or the very sad part, is that a large number of Europeans have swallowed this pill, many, many more than during the Vietnam War, that right now, as Jens Stoltenberg said, weapons are actually the way to peace, and that everybody wants peace. The Russians want their peace, the Europeans want their peace, and the Ukrainians want it in their way. And at the moment, the logic that we have is that both sides, the Russians, the Europeans, I mean NATO, and the Ukrainians, are only willing to accept an outcome that would align with their goals. And the way that we got there is through constant escalation. And as we have heard from Friedrich Glasl just a few weeks ago, this escalation trajectory of the different conflicts that have been going on has been getting worse and worse. And what are those conflicts? It's at least three. A conflict between Russia and the United States, a great power conflict. A war in Ukraine between the Russians and the West Ukrainians, and a war even deeper inside Ukraine between the Eastern Ukrainians in the Donbass and the Western Ukrainians on the other hand, and these linguistic groups. It's not all about the linguistic parts, of course, but the matter of the fact is that you have several conflicts inside Ukraine that could be used in order for outside forces to tap into them. And we've seen how it got worse. And everybody who's older than like 35 years or so will remember that Ukraine spiraled out of control ever after 2014, ever after the Maidan. Now, one group in Europe says, well, this was a revolution of dignity, right? Of Ukraine basically finding itself and expelling a corrupt leader. But the matter of the fact is the corrupt leader was democratically elected. He was a democratically elected leader, and he was not more or less corrupt than others that were ruling over Ukraine before and after. And after 2014, when Ukraine still had a neutrality clause in its constitution, just remember that. The Ukrainian constitution said Ukraine will be neutral. That was replaced by a clause that said Ukraine will seek for NATO membership, in also response to 2008, when it was promised NATO membership, when Ukraine wasn't even asking for it yet. So you see how this dynamic just made things get worse, because then the Russians invade Crimea and clip it off Ukraine. Ukraine uses that as a reason to the leadership in Kiev uses it as a reason to get rid of the neutrality clause, and then you have this Minsk agreement, which later on even Angela Merkel and Hollande said it was only done in order. It was only a deal cut in order to allow more time to arm Ukraine for 7 years. And now we're at the point where you have a NATO army staffed with Ukrainians fighting against Russians in Ukraine. And does this absolve Russia from the sin of invasion? No, it doesn't. And I got a lot of negative reactions about that, but it is really important to remember one thing. In 1945, it was again outlawed to do an aggressive war. The only exception is Article 51 in the UN Charter, which says you are allowed to defend your own country, and the and is the problem, you are allowed to help another country to defend its own territory. And this goddamn clause that allows for collective self-defense has been used in almost every single war since 1945 to justify invasions. It was exactly that kind of argument that was used by the Americans to invade Iraq. It was that argument that was used to bomb Libya to hell. It was that argument that's being used even in Syria whenever there's like interventionism from the West. It's like, oh, we're just helping these like poor group people X or state X to defend itself. And Russia is doing exactly the same because it recognized the Donbass republics 5 days before the invasion in order to argue that under international law, it's just helping the Ukrainians to defend itself. And this idea that you go and defend yourself with others abroad, self-defense abroad, is the kernel of all aggressive evil since the Second World War. And even though I understand why Russia invaded, and I'm not a friend of that, I understand the logic behind it, because the Russians do feel vulnerable, and every single security experts, even in the US, from George Kennan, Jack Matlock, and so on. They've all said Ukraine has a very special place to the Russians. If you try to make it a NATO member, there will be a war. Now you try to make it a member, there is a war. This was foreseeable. It wasn't good. It wasn't right, but it was foreseeable. And what should have happened was de-escalation. Now we know from Jeffrey Sachs and others that de-escalation is something that the neocons actively don't want. And for over a year, I had this question: why is it that Ukraine didn't become neutral? Or why is it that neutrality didn't emerge naturally as a way to pacify the entire region? Because it would be in the interests of everybody. It would have been in the interest of Ukraine, of the Western Europeans, and of the Russians. And we know that the Russians wanted it. But we also now know that this tiny group of neocons proactively worked against such an outcome. So we know that there were people who said it's better to risk or even have a war than to settle for anything less but total control and total dominance. And within this logic of war, if you have neocons who go for that strategy, you know that on the other hand, the Russians at some point will actually will be forced to go along, because otherwise you don't have a state left. Otherwise they will just try to bring the fight to you. And that's what the Russians understood from the reactions of the West, especially in 2021, when the West just said, like, no, we are not going to negotiate with you any kind of security settlement in Europe. Russia, you have to know your place, sit down and shut up. They didn't. It was war. The Russians, Vladimir Putin, chose to actually assert the Russia's point here in the geopolitical field. And that then creates this logic, right? That then creates this problem that you force each other to fight, and the Russians force the Ukrainians to fight. It's not difficult to know why the Ukrainians fight. Yes, you do have probably a corrupt regime in Kiev, but you also have people who are under attack, and everybody will fight for their own land. The Austrians would fight for their land, and the Swiss would fight for theirs. And if you put a knife at the throat of someone, they will try to defend themselves. And the Russians felt like they had a knife at their throat, and the Ukrainians are feeling like they have having a knife at their throat, and this is being fueled from the outside. So what we need to do is to get back to a de-escalation. Just at the moment, it still doesn't look like it. And the Europeans are still caught in this idea that Putin is Hitler, and Hitler had to be defeated. Now, this is what I call the long shadow of Adolf Hitler, because with Adolf Hitler, you again justify fighting in the East, kill as many Russians as possible, have in the process as many Ukrainians slaughtered as necessary. But Europe is willing to do that at the moment, and willing to see Ukraine shattered. And they would rather have every single Ukrainian dead than give Ukraine up to the Russians. And that kind of mentality is a very, very European mentality. It's this: we dictate what's going to happen, and we are going to cushion it in the rosy language of being good citizens, of doing the right thing, of standing up for justice, when in fact all it is bleeding out the poorest people of Europe. And believe me, it is no coincidence that Ukraine before the war and also now is the poorest country in Europe, because the bourgeoisie and those goddamn warmongers that have so much money and that make so much money, they always let others bleed. And currently the Western warmongers and business leaders, they let the Ukrainian proletariat bleed for them, and the Russians, they hired their poorest people with like big promise of big salaries to go and bleed for them in Ukraine. And this will just perpetuate itself unless this chain is broken. Now, the chain cannot be broken, unfortunately, by the Ukrainians, probably not even by the Russians, but it could be broken by the Europeans. If the Europeans finally said enough is enough, we will sit down and negotiate with the people that we don't agree with. Because that's what you do. You don't do peace negotiations with your enemies. You negotiate peace well, you don't negotiate peace with your friends. You negotiate peace with your enemies. It is an incredible tragedy. And the hope I have is that maybe from the outside, from people that are not caught in this bubble of this good against evil, from the Indians, from the Southeast Asians, that we get help from them, because Europe at the moment needs help, because it is caught again in its very own, very European BS, thinking that you need to use war in order to get to the good solution, and using again Hitler as an argument to do so. So, my friends, the logic of war and this spiraling into catastrophe needs to be broken, and I hope that an outside force will do so, and that we can then enjoy the beautiful nature and friendship of the Ukrainians, of the Russians, and of the Americans somewhere in the Alps. Thank you.